The rain hammered the tin roof of the old barn like bullets, each drop echoing through the empty space that had become Jake Morrison's burden. 6 months ago, when Grandpa Earl left him this place, the neighbors called it a joke, 200 acres of dust and a barn ready to collapse. They whispered behind his back at the hardware store, laughed when his crops failed, and shook their heads when the bank notices started piling up. But Jake had a secret the town didn't know. Before the farm, before the debt, he'd been a forensic archaeologist who'd walked away from a promising career after a devastating mistake cost him everything. Now, as his German Shepherd Rex pawed frantically at the rotting floorboards, whining in that urgent way that meant discovery, Jake's trained eye caught something the others would miss. The wood here was different, newer, like someone had deliberately covered something up. When Rex's claws finally broke through, the musty smell that rose from below carried with it the weight of decades-old secrets. Could this crumbling barn hold the key to saving not just the farm, but Jake's entire future? Jake knelt beside Rex, running his weathered hands over the splintered boards. The dog's behavior reminded him of the cadaver dogs he'd worked with in Bosnia, that same intense focus when they caught a scent that didn't belong. But this wasn't about death. Rex's tail wagged with excitement, not the somber alertness of finding remains. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, pulling a flashlight from his jacket pocket. The beam cut through the darkness below, revealing a cavity that shouldn't exist. His grandfather had never mentioned anything about a cellar or storage space beneath the barn floor. The replacement boards were oak, distinctly different from the original pine flooring that dominated the rest of the structure. Someone had taken care to match the stain, but Jake's trained eye picked up the subtle differences in grain pattern and weathering. This section had been installed maybe 30 years ago, he estimated, right around the time Grandpa Earl would have been in his prime. Rex whined again, pawing at the edge of the hole. Jake grabbed the dog's collar gently. "Hold on, let me think this through." His archaeological instincts kicked in despite himself. Document first, excavate second. But this wasn't a dig site. This was his property, his mystery to unravel. Still, old habits died hard. He pulled out his phone and snapped several photos of the wood patterns, the way the boards had been fitted together, the tools marks along the edges. The cavity below appeared to be about 3 feet deep and roughly 6 feet square, large enough to hide something substantial. Jake's pulse quickened as he remembered stories his grandfather used to tell about the old days, about making ends meet during the Depression, about doing what needed to be done to keep the family fed. Thunder cracked overhead, and Jake realized the storm was getting worse. Water had begun dripping through the barn's compromised roof, and he didn't want whatever lay hidden below to get damaged. He needed to act fast. "Stay," he commanded Rex, then grabbed a crowbar from his toolbox near the barn door. The remaining boards came up easier than expected, as if they'd been designed for removal. Someone had thought this through carefully. As the last board came free, Jake's flashlight beam revealed a wooden chest about the size of a large steamer trunk sitting in the earthen cavity. The wood was dark with age but appeared solid, protected from moisture by what looked like a layer of oiled canvas. Jake's hands trembled as he cleared away the loose dirt and debris. This felt like Christmas morning and archaeological discovery rolled into one. Rex had settled into a patient sit, watching intently as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The chest was heavier than Jake expected when he finally managed to wrestle it up onto the barn floor. Solid wood construction with brass corners and a complex-looking lock that had somehow avoided rust despite the years underground. No obvious markings or inscriptions, but the craftsmanship suggested value. Jake sat back on his heels, staring at the chest while rain continued its relentless assault on the tin roof. His grandfather had been a simple farmer, or so Jake had always believed. Earl Morrison raised corn and soybeans, fixed his own equipment, and never seemed to have 2 nickels to rub together. Yet here was evidence of secrets, of deliberate concealment. The lock looked old but sturdy. Jake could probably force it, but his archaeological training screamed against such destructive methods. There had to be a key somewhere, or perhaps another way to open it without damage. Rex suddenly perked up, ears rotating toward the barn door. Through the sound of rain, Jake caught the distant rumble of an engine. Headlights swept across the barn wall as a vehicle turned into his driveway. Company was the last thing he needed right now. The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown pasture as Jake trudged through knee-high weeds toward the sagging farmhouse. His work boots crunched on broken glass from a shattered window, and he made a mental note to add that to his growing list of repairs. The list was already 3 pages long, written in his cramped handwriting on the back of an overdue electric bill. Rusty bounded ahead, tail wagging as he investigated every fascinating scent the property had to offer. At least someone was enjoying this mess, Jake thought bitterly. The golden retriever had been his constant companion for the past 5 years, ever since Jake's wife Sarah had left him. "I can't watch you fail anymore," she'd said, her suitcase already packed. Rusty had stayed. The front porch groaned ominously under Jake's weight as he approached the door. Paint peeled from the wooden siding like diseased skin, and the roof sagged in places where shingles had given up their battle against time and weather. He'd inherited this monument to decay from his grandfather Edmund, a man he'd barely known but apparently the only relative willing to leave Jake anything in his will. The lawyer, Mr. Hartwell, had delivered the news with barely concealed pity. "I'm afraid there are significant back taxes owed," he'd explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The property has been abandoned for nearly 15 years. Your grandfather was, well, let's say he became something of a recluse in his final years." Jake pushed open the front door, which protested with a screech that sent birds fleeing from the nearby oak tree. The smell hit him immediately: mildew, rot, and something else he couldn't quite identify, something musty and old, like secrets left too long in the dark. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. The living room was a disaster zone of overturned furniture, yellowed newspapers, and what appeared to be decades of accumulated junk. Raccoons had clearly made themselves at home, leaving their calling cards scattered across the warped hardwood floors. Rusty padded through the debris with his nose to the ground, occasionally pausing to sniff at something particularly interesting. Jake surveyed the damage with growing despair. The bank had given him 60 days to bring the property taxes current or face foreclosure. Even if he sold his remaining farm equipment and scraped together every penny, he'd still be short nearly $8,000. "What were you thinking, Grandpa?" Jake muttered, kicking at a pile of moldy magazines. He remembered Edmund Thorne as a tall, stern man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. The old man had visited maybe twice during Jake's childhood, appearing unexpectedly at family gatherings like a ghost materializing from the past. His father had always grown tense when Edmund's name came up, changing the subject with uncomfortable haste. A loud crash from the kitchen made Jake jump. He found Rusty standing over the remains of what had once been a cabinet door, his tail wagging apologetically. "Great," Jake sighed. "Add that to the list." As he bent to clean up the splintered wood, Jake noticed something odd about the kitchen floor. The hardwood planks were warped and stained, but in one corner near the old cast-iron stove, several boards seemed different somehow. Newer, maybe, or at least not as weathered as the rest. He knelt for a closer look, running his fingers along the edges of the planks. They were definitely different, slightly thicker, with a different grain pattern. More importantly, they weren't nailed down like the surrounding boards. They seemed to be fitted together like puzzle pieces, designed to be removed. Rusty wandered over and began sniffing at the same spot, his behavior suddenly more focused. The dog's hackles rose slightly, and he whined, a sound Jake had learned to pay attention to. Rusty's instincts had saved him from a cotton-mouthed snake just last summer. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, but Rusty just continued his intense investigation of the floorboards. Jake found a butter knife in one of the kitchen drawers and worked it between the planks. With some effort, he managed to pry up one of the boards. Beneath it was darkness, not just the crawl space he'd expected, but what appeared to be a deeper cavity. The smell that wafted up was different from the general mustiness of the house. This was earthier, more intentional, like a root cellar or storm shelter that had been sealed for years. Rusty's whining became more insistent, and he began pawing at the exposed opening. Jake pried up 2 more boards, revealing a rectangular opening about 3 feet by 2 feet. Even with the kitchen windows, it was too dark to see what lay beneath. He pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight function, pointing it down into the cavity. The beam revealed rough wooden steps leading down into what appeared to be a small underground chamber. Jake's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a deliberate construction built with care and purpose, and judging by the look in Rusty's eyes, whatever was down there was worth investigating. The morning sun cast long shadows across the warped porch as Jake stood before his grandfather's house, coffee mug in hand, surveying the monumental task ahead. 3 days had passed since the reading of the will, and the reality of his inheritance felt heavier with each sunrise. The Victorian structure loomed before him like a patient waiting for surgery, its gingerbread trim hanging at odd angles and several shutters missing entirely. Rex emerged from beneath the porch, his golden coat dusty and cobwebs clinging to his ears. The dog had taken to exploring every inch of the property with the enthusiasm of an archaeologist, disappearing for hours only to return with mysterious dirt stains and an expression of profound satisfaction. "Find anything interesting down there, boy?" Jake asked, scratching behind Rex's ears. The dog wagged his tail and trotted toward the front door, looking back as if to say the real treasures were inside. Jake had been avoiding the interior for good reason. Yesterday's brief reconnaissance had revealed a maze of rooms filled with decades of accumulated possessions. His grandfather had apparently never thrown anything away. Newspapers from the 1960s sat stacked beside broken furniture, moth-eaten clothing hung in closets like ghosts, and every surface was layered with dust thick enough to write novels in. The screen door protested with a prolonged screech as Jake stepped inside. The smell hit him immediately, a mixture of old wood, dust, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Something sweet and organic, like dried flowers or old perfume. Rex bounded ahead, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors as he navigated between towers of cardboard boxes and abandoned furniture. In the living room, Jake began the methodical process of sorting through his grandfather's life. Photo albums revealed a young man he barely recognized, his grandfather in military uniform, standing proudly beside a beautiful woman Jake assumed was his grandmother. She had died when Jake was very young, leaving only fragments of memory. Soft hands, the smell of vanilla, and a laugh that sounded like music. Rex had grown restless, pacing between rooms with increasing agitation. The dog would disappear into the kitchen, then return to circle Jake's work area, whining softly. When Jake ignored him, Rex resorted to more dramatic measures, grabbing the corner of a photo album and tugging gently. "What's gotten into you?" Jake asked, but Rex was already trotting toward the kitchen, looking back to ensure Jake was following. The kitchen was perhaps the most depressing room in the house. The linoleum was cracked and curling at the edges. The appliances were harvest gold relics from the 1970s, and water stains on the ceiling suggested plumbing issues that would require serious attention. Rex positioned himself near the far corner of the room, pawing at a section of floor where the linoleum had pulled away completely. Jake knelt beside his dog, running his hand over the exposed floorboards. They were old pine, darkened with age and wear, but something seemed different about this section. The boards here appeared slightly raised, as if they'd been removed and replaced multiple times. When he pressed down, they gave more than they should have, and he could hear a hollow echo from beneath. "You think there's something under here, don't you, boy?" Rex's tail wagged furiously, and he began pawing more insistently at the loose boards. Jake fetched a crowbar from his truck and returned to find Rex sitting at attention, like a soldier awaiting orders. The first board came up easily, too easily. Someone had definitely been here before, and recently enough that the nails hadn't had time to rust into permanent position. The second and third boards followed suit, revealing a dark rectangular space beneath the kitchen floor. The smell that emerged was different from the rest of the house, drier, more contained, with a hint of cedar and old paper. Jake pulled out his phone's flashlight and peered into the cavity. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Below the floorboards lay a metal strongbox, its surface dulled with age but otherwise intact. Beside it sat several wrapped bundles and what appeared to be rolled documents tied with ribbon. Rex whined with excitement, his nose twitching at the scents rising from the hidden chamber. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he reached down and lifted the strongbox. It was heavier than expected, and when he shook it gently, he could hear the rustle of papers and the soft clink of what might have been coins or jewelry. His grandfather's final secret was literally beneath his feet, waiting 40 years to be discovered. The morning sun cast long shadows across the warped floorboards as Jake knelt beside the hole Rusty had torn open. His heart hammered against his ribs as he peered into the darkness below. The musty smell of decades-old secrets wafted up from the gap, mixed with something else he couldn't identify, something metallic and cold. "Easy, boy," he whispered to Rusty, whose tail wagged furiously despite the tension crackling in the air. The dog whined softly, pawing at the edge of the opening as if urging Jake to look deeper. Jake fumbled for his phone's flashlight, his hands trembling slightly. The weak beam cut through the shadows, revealing a space that shouldn't exist, a hidden compartment carved into the foundation itself. His grandfather had been thorough, disguising the hiding spot so well that decades of inspections and repairs had never uncovered it. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, sat nestled in the hollow space. Its surface was covered in a thick layer of dust, but Jake could make out intricate carvings along its edges, symbols that looked almost ritualistic. Beside it lay a rolled bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, and scattered around both items were what appeared to be old photographs and documents sealed in protective plastic. Jake's mind raced. His grandfather had always been secretive about his past, deflecting questions with stories about the weather or complaints about the government. The old man had died when Jake was 16, taking whatever secrets he harbored to the grave, or so Jake had thought. Carefully, he reached into the space and retrieved the box first. It was heavier than expected, and something shifted inside when he lifted it. The wood was dark with age, and the carvings seemed to dance in the flickering light of his phone. He set it aside and reached for the cloth bundle. The oiled wrapping crackled as he unwound it, revealing a leather journal bound with a strip of rawhide. The cover was worn smooth, and Jake could barely make out his grandfather's initials embossed near the bottom corner. His pulse quickened as he opened to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's, the same careful script Jake remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists. But the words themselves made no immediate sense. They were written in what looked like a mixture of English and something else, possibly German or Dutch. Dates scattered throughout the pages suggested the entries spanned several decades, starting in the 1940s. Rusty whined again, more insistently this time. Jake looked up to see the dog's ears perked toward the front of the house. In the distance, the rumble of an approaching vehicle made Jake's stomach lurch. He quickly gathered the box, journal, and remaining items from the hiding spot, shoving them into an old canvas bag he'd brought for hauling debris. The engine sound grew louder, definitely heading up his driveway. Jake kicked some loose boards over the hole and grabbed a hammer from his toolbox, trying to look like he'd been working on normal repairs. Rusty trotted to the window, his low growl confirming that whoever was approaching wasn't entirely welcome. Through the grimy glass, Jake watched a black sedan pull up beside his truck. The car was too clean, too expensive for anyone he knew in town. Two men in dark suits climbed out, moving with the kind of careful precision that made Jake's instincts scream warnings. They weren't real estate agents or county inspectors. These men had the bearing of people accustomed to getting answers to questions others preferred not to ask. The taller of the two knocked on the front door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the empty house. Jake remained perfectly still, hoping they'd assume no one was home. But Rusty had other ideas. The dog barked once, loud and clear, before Jake could stop him. "Mr. Hartwell," the voice carried through the thin walls. "We'd like to speak with you about your grandfather's property." Jake's blood ran cold. How did they know his name? More importantly, how did they know about his grandfather? He clutched the canvas bag tighter, acutely aware of the weight of secrets it now contained. Whatever was in that box, whatever his grandfather had hidden away, these men knew about it. "We know you're in there, sir. We just want to talk." The second man's voice was softer, but somehow more menacing. Jake heard footsteps circling the house, checking windows, testing doors. They weren't giving up easily. He looked down at Rusty, who had positioned himself between Jake and the door, hackles raised. The dog's instincts had led them to this discovery, and now those same instincts were screaming danger. Jake realized he had two choices: face these men and risk losing whatever his grandfather had died protecting, or find another way out. The back door was his only option. Jake slung the bag over his shoulder and motioned for Rusty to follow him toward the rear of the house, moving as quietly as the creaking floorboards would allow. The metallic clinking echoed through the farmhouse as Jake pried up another rotted floorboard, his heart hammering against his ribs. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through cracked windows, and the musty smell of decades-old decay filled his nostrils. Rusty sat nearby, tail wagging furiously, occasionally whimpering with excitement as if he understood the magnitude of what they'd discovered. The leather pouch Jake had pulled from beneath the first loose board sat open on the kitchen table, its contents spilled across the scarred wooden surface. Dozens of cut gemstones caught the light like captured stars, emeralds, sapphires, and what appeared to be diamonds. But it was the folded papers tucked inside the pouch that made Jake's hands tremble as he smoothed them out. The first document was a hand-drawn map of the property, but not like any survey he'd ever seen. Strange symbols marked various locations around the farm, with cryptic notations in his grandfather's familiar scrawl. Northern pasture, third oak from the stone wall, barn foundation, southeast corner post, well house, beneath the pump mechanism. Each marking was accompanied by a small X and what looked like inventory numbers. The second paper was a letter, yellow with age, addressed to my heir, whoever you may be. Jake's grandfather's handwriting was shakier here, as if written during his final illness. "If you're reading this, then Rusty did his job. That dog's smarter than most folks give him credit for. What you found is just the beginning. During the war, I did things I'm not proud of, but I also saved things that would have been lost forever. The Nazis weren't the only ones looting treasures. Sometimes good men had to make hard choices to keep history from being destroyed." Jake's breath caught. His grandfather had served in World War II, but he'd never spoken about his experiences overseas. The family had always assumed he'd been a simple infantryman. The letter continued. "I was part of a unit tasked with recovering stolen artifacts and artworks. When the war ended, some items fell through the cracks of official channels. Items that belonged to families who'd been murdered, with no living relatives to claim them. I couldn't bear to see them disappear into government warehouses or private collections of corrupt officers." Jake sank into a chair, the implications washing over him. His grandfather had been some kind of treasure hunter, recovering Nazi-looted art and artifacts. But instead of turning everything over to authorities, he'd kept some pieces, presumably the ones with no clear rightful owners. "I spent 40 years trying to research the provenance of each item, hoping to find surviving family members or appropriate museums. Some I was able to return quietly. Others, well, that's why you're reading this now. The map will show you where everything is hidden. Each cache is waterproofed and sealed. I estimate the total value at several $1 million, maybe more, several $1 million. Jake's vision blurred as he read the number again. Yesterday he'd been facing bankruptcy, and now... Jake set the letter down with shaking hands. Rusty padded over and rested his massive head on Jake's knee, brown eyes gazing up with what looked like understanding. "Jesus, boy," Jake whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. What did the old man get us into? He studied the map again, counting the marked locations. 12 separate hiding spots scattered across the 30-acre property. If his grandfather's estimate was accurate, Jake was potentially sitting on one of the largest private collections of recovered war artifacts in existence. But the letter's warning echoed in his mind. People who would kill for them. Jake thought about the whispered conversations he'd overheard in town, the way certain locals had reacted when news of his inheritance spread. Had someone else known about his grandfather's secret? Was that why some folks seemed so interested in whether he planned to sell the property? A truck rumbled up the driveway, and Jake quickly gathered the papers and gemstones, shoving them back into the leather pouch. Through the window, he saw Bill Henderson climbing out of his pickup, that same predatory smile from the diner plastered across his face. Jake stuffed the pouch under a loose couch cushion and tried to look casual as Henderson's boots clomped across the front porch. Rusty's ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, but he shared the dog's instincts. Something about Henderson's unexpected visit felt wrong. The knock on the door was sharp and impatient, and Jake realized his life had just become infinitely more complicated. The metallic taste of fear filled Jake's mouth as he stared at the yellowed documents spread across his kitchen table. 3 days had passed since Rex's discovery, and each page he'd carefully extracted from the leather portfolio revealed another piece of a puzzle that made his grandfather's death seem increasingly suspicious. Birth certificates, property deeds, and bank statements dating back to the 1940s painted a picture of Harold Whitmore that Jake had never known existed. His grandfather hadn't been the simple farmer everyone believed him to be. According to these documents, Harold had owned mineral rights to half the county, including vast deposits of lithium that were only now becoming valuable with the electric car boom. Jake's hands trembled as he held up a geological survey from 1987. The paper was signed by Dr. Elizabeth Chen from the State Mining Commission, confirming deposits worth an estimated $43 million beneath Whitmore land. But what chilled him to the bone was the handwritten note scrawled in the margin, "HW, they know, be careful. EC." Rex whined softly from his position by the window, ears perked toward the gravel road. Jake looked up to see dust clouds approaching, a black sedan moving too fast for a casual visit. He quickly gathered the documents, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was comforting Rex or himself. The sedan pulled into his driveway with an aggressive crunch of gravel. 2 men in dark suits emerged, their movements deliberate and practiced. Jake recognized neither of them, but something about their bearing made him think of corporate lawyers or worse. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Rex growled low in his throat, hackles rising. Jake tucked the most important documents into his jacket and walked to the door, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. When he opened it, the taller man smiled with cold efficiency. "Mr. Whitmore? I'm Thomas Brennan from Consolidated Mining Enterprises. This is my associate, Mr. Rodriguez. We'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." "I'm not interested in selling," Jake said immediately. Brennan's smile never wavered. "Perhaps we could come in? What we have to offer might change your mind." "The porch is fine." The men exchanged a glance. Rodriguez stepped closer, and Jake caught sight of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. "Mr. Whitmore," Brennan continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, "you've inherited property that has certain complications. We're prepared to offer you $500,000 for the land and mineral rights, cash, today." Jake's mouth went dry. 500,000 was more money than he'd ever dreamed of, but these documents suggested the land was worth nearly 100 times that amount. "Why the rush?" he asked. "Let's just say that your grandfather was involved in some legal disputes before his death. Disputes that could tie up this property in court for years. Our offer would resolve all of those issues cleanly." "What kind of disputes?" Rodriguez shifted impatiently, his jacket falling open slightly. Jake definitely saw a gun. "The kind that can be very expensive to fight," Brennan said. "Your grandfather made some enemies, Mr. Whitmore. People who might not be as reasonable as we are. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Rex pressed against Jake's leg, sensing the tension. "I need time to think about it," Jake said. "I'm afraid this is a limited-time offer. We need an answer now." Before Jake could respond, another vehicle turned into his driveway, Sheriff Morrison's patrol car. Brennan and Rodriguez tensed visibly as the sheriff climbed out, hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Afternoon, Jake," Morrison called out, his eyes never leaving the two strangers. "Everything all right here?" "These gentlemen were just leaving," Jake said quickly. Brennan's corporate smile returned, but his eyes remained cold. "Of course. Mr. Whitmore, you have our card, but don't wait too long to call. Opportunities like this don't last forever." The two men walked to their sedan with measured steps, neither looking back. As they drove away, Sheriff Morrison approached the porch. "Friends of yours?" he asked. "Never saw them before in my life. They wanted to buy the property." Morrison's weathered face creased with concern. "Jake, I've been thinking about your grandfather's accident. Something's been bothering me about it." "What do you mean?" Harold was the most careful man I knew. Checking his equipment was like a religion to him. For that harness to fail... Morrison shook his head. "I'd like to take another look at the scene, if you don't mind." Jake felt the documents crinkle against his chest as he nodded. "Sheriff, what do you know about Consolidated Mining Enterprises? Never heard of them." "Why?" "Just curious." Jake watched the dust from the sedan settling on his driveway. "When do you want to check the barn? How about now, before we lose the light?" As they walked toward the old barn where Harold had died, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather, secrets, were about to get them all killed. The musty scent of old paper and leather filled Jake's nostrils as he carefully lifted the metal box from its hiding place beneath the floorboards. His hands trembled slightly as he set it on the kitchen table, the weight of it substantial and promising. Rusty sat beside him, tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done, occasionally sniffing at the mysterious container. The box itself was unremarkable, a simple steel lockbox, the kind banks used to issue decades ago. Rust had claimed most of the surface, but Jake could make out faded initials etched into the lid. M. Edmund Morrison. His grandfather's name sent a chill down his spine. Jake tried the latch, but it held fast. The lock was old but solid, requiring either a key or some creative persuasion. He rummaged through the kitchen drawers, finding a sturdy screwdriver and a hammer among the scattered utensils. The metal groaned in protest as he worked the screwdriver into the gap between the lid and base, applying gentle pressure. "Come on, Grandpa," he muttered. "What were you hiding?" After several minutes of careful prying, the lock mechanism gave way with a satisfying click. Jake paused, suddenly aware of his racing heartbeat. Whatever lay inside this box had been important enough for his grandfather to hide it beneath the floorboards and keep it secret for who knows how long. He lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was a bundle of documents wrapped in oiled cloth, his grandfather's attempt to protect them from moisture and time. Beneath that lay several small velvet pouches and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. Jake carefully unwrapped the documents, his eyes widening as he recognized official seals and government letterheads. The top document was a geological survey report dated 1952, commissioned by the State Mining Authority. Jake's eyes scanned the technical language until he found what made his breath catch: significant mineral deposits identified on Morrison property, Sector 7A through 12C, estimated value pending further exploration. His hands shaking now, Jake reached for one of the velvet pouches. Inside, smooth stones caught the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window. They weren't large, most no bigger than his thumbnail, but even to his untrained eye, they possessed an unmistakable quality. The way they seemed to capture and hold the light, the perfect clarity, the subtle fire within each one. Diamonds, raw, uncut diamonds. Jake sank into his grandfather's old chair, the magnitude of his discovery beginning to settle in. He picked up the journal, its leather cover worn smooth by handling. The pages were filled with his grandfather's careful handwriting, chronicling discoveries, mapping locations, recording weights and measurements. May 15th, 1953, one entry read, "Found another cluster near the old oak. These stones are unlike anything I've seen. George at the assay office confirmed my suspicions. We're sitting on something extraordinary, but I can't let word get out. Not yet. Too many people would come, and this land has been in our family too long to lose it to outside interests. The boy will inherit this someday." Read another entry from 1975. "James is too focused on city life to appreciate what we have here, but perhaps his son will understand. The land holds secrets that could change everything, but only for someone patient enough to respect them." A newspaper clipping fell from between the pages. The headline read, "Local mining company seeks expansion rights." The article detailed how Morrison Holdings, apparently a subsidiary of some larger corporation, had been quietly purchasing mineral rights throughout the county, offering farmers substantial sums for properties that seemed worthless on the surface. Rusty whined softly. Sensing his master's agitation, Jake reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, grateful for the grounding presence of his faithful companion. None of this made sense yet, but one thing was becoming clear. His grandfather had been far from the simple farmer everyone believed him to be. Jake carefully gathered the documents and stones, his mind already working through the implications. If the geological survey was accurate, if his grandfather's journal was truthful, then this crumbling property wasn't the worthless inheritance everyone thought it was. It was a gold mine, or rather, a diamond mine. The question now was what to do with this knowledge, and more importantly, who else might already know about it. The first hint of dawn crept through the farmhouse windows as Jake carefully lifted another rotted floorboard, his hands trembling with anticipation. The wooden planks came away easier now, as if the house itself wanted to surrender its secrets. Beside him, Rusty panted softly, tail wagging in that peculiar way that suggested he knew something momentous was happening. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he played his flashlight beam into the depths. The ladder looked sturdy enough, though it had to be decades old, possibly older. His grandfather had been a meticulous man, Jake remembered, the type who built things to last. If Harold Brennan had constructed this hiding place, it would be solid. "What do you think, boy?" Jake whispered to Rusty, who responded by sniffing eagerly at the opening. Should we see what Grandpa Harold was really up to? The decision made itself. Jake had nothing left to lose and potentially everything to gain. He lowered himself through the opening, testing each rung carefully before committing his full weight. The ladder held firm, and within moments he stood on solid ground 8 feet below his kitchen floor. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked 3 high in places. Each bore strange markings and shipping labels in languages Jake couldn't identify. Some looked ancient, their wood dark with age, while others appeared more recent. In the center of the room sat a heavy wooden table covered with papers, maps, and what looked like photographs. Jake approached the table first, his flashlight beam dancing across the scattered documents. The topmost paper was a letter written in his grandfather's careful handwriting, addressed simply to my heir. Jake's hands shook as he lifted it and began to read. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've discovered what I've spent 40 years building. I hope you're ready for the truth about our family, because it's not what anyone in Millbrook believes." Jake's eyes raced across the page, absorbing details that seemed impossible. His grandfather hadn't been the simple farmer everyone thought. Harold Brennan had been what the letter termed a cultural preservation specialist, working with museums and private collectors around the world to recover stolen artifacts and return them to their rightful owners. The chamber wasn't just a hiding place, it was a way station, a temporary sanctuary for priceless objects making their way home after being lost to war, theft, or the black market. Some pieces stayed for weeks, others for years, waiting for the right moment and the right connections to complete their journeys. "The work isn't always legal in the strictest sense," Harold's letter continued, "but it's always right. These artifacts belong to their people, their cultures, their homelands. I've been honored to play a small part in seeing them returned." Jake lowered the letter, his mind reeling. He moved to the nearest crate and carefully pried off the lid, revealing something wrapped in soft cloth. Inside was a carved jade figure, exquisite in its detail and obviously ancient. A small tag attached to the wrapping bore Chinese characters and what appeared to be coordinates. Moving from crate to crate, Jake discovered a treasure trove that defied imagination. African masks, Incan pottery, European paintings rolled in protective tubes, Roman coins, medieval manuscripts sealed in protective cases. Each item was carefully catalogued, with documentation indicating its origin and intended destination. But it was the final crate that made Jake's legs weak. Unlike the others, this one bore a tag-marked payment. JB inside, wrapped in velvet, lay enough cut diamonds to fund a small country. A note explained they were payment for his grandfather's services from a grateful collector whose family heirlooms had been recovered from Nazi plunder. "This is yours," Harold's letter concluded. "Use it wisely. The other items in this chamber each have homes waiting for them. I've included all the contacts and instructions you'll need. You can continue the work if you choose, or simply complete these final missions and walk away. Either way, you'll never want for anything again." Jake sank into the chair beside the table, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his discovery. Above him, he could hear Rusty pacing anxiously, occasionally whimpering at the edge of the opening. The loyal dog had uncovered more than rotted floorboards. He'd revealed a legacy that transformed everything Jake thought he knew about his family and his future. The diamonds alone were worth millions, but the responsibility that came with them weighed heavy on his shoulders. His grandfather had trusted him with secrets that could change or destroy lives. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows as Jake carefully examined the leather-bound journal his grandfather had hidden beneath the floorboards. Rex sat beside him, occasionally nudging his arm as if sensing the gravity of what they'd discovered. The pages crackled with age as Jake turned them, revealing his grandfather's meticulous handwriting and detailed sketches of the property. "Survey maps," Jake whispered, tracing his finger along the intricate drawings. "But these don't match the official property lines." According to the journal, the land extended far beyond what Jake had assumed he'd inherited. His grandfather had documented every boundary marker, every natural landmark, and most intriguingly, every place he'd found traces of what he called the old workings. The entries dated back 40 years, chronicling a methodical search across the entire property. Jake's phone buzzed. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Any luck with the research?" he answered. "More than you might expect." Her voice carried an edge of excitement. "I've been at the county clerk's office since they opened. Jake, there are some serious discrepancies in your property records. The deed you have shows 12 acres, but the original surveyor's notes from 1952 describe 43 acres. Jake's heart raced as he flipped through more pages of the journal. "Sarah, I think Grandpa knew. He documented everything. There are maps here that show the property extending all the way to Miller's Creek. That's impossible. The Hartwell family owns that land. They've had it for decades. Maybe not legally." Jake found a page filled with his grandfather's angry scrawl. "Listen to this. Confirmed today that Hartwell has been paying taxes on my land for 15 years. County records deliberately altered. Must find proof before confronting him." The line went quiet for a moment. "Jake, if that's true, we're not just talking about missing acreage. The creek runs through some of the most valuable real estate in the county. That's where Hartwell wants to build his resort." Jake stood up abruptly, causing Rex to bark in surprise. "That's why he's been so eager to buy my property. It's not about my 12 acres. It's about establishing legitimate access to land he's been illegally claiming." "There's more," Sarah continued. "I pulled the geological surveys from the 1950s. Your grandfather was right about the mineral deposits. The reports mention significant copper veins running beneath the property. But here is the interesting part. The survey area includes the disputed land by the creek. Jake's mind raced as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. His grandfather hadn't just been a struggling farmer, he'd been conducting a decades-long investigation into stolen land and hidden resources. The old man had died before he could act on his discoveries, leaving behind only cryptic warnings and this carefully hidden journal. "We need to get out there," Jake said, grabbing his jacket. Grandpa marked specific locations where he found evidence of mining activity. "If we can prove the mineral deposits extend across the property lines, it might help establish the legitimate boundaries." An hour later, Jake and Rex were hiking through dense woods that Jake had never known belonged to him. Sarah had driven directly from town, bringing her camera and a GPS device to document their findings. The journal's hand-drawn maps proved remarkably accurate as they located each landmark his grandfather had noted. There, Jake pointed to an outcropping of rocks that matched a detailed sketch in the journal. He wrote that this was where he found the strongest copper traces. Sarah examined the area, taking photos from multiple angles. "These rocks definitely show mineral staining, and look at this." She pointed to what appeared to be natural erosion, but Jake could now see it formed an almost deliberate pattern. Rex had wandered ahead, sniffing around a cluster of fallen logs. Suddenly, he began barking and pawing at the ground with the same intensity he'd shown at the house. Jake consulted the journal again. Grandpa wrote about finding evidence of recent excavation, but he never mentioned who was responsible. He paused, reading further. "Wait. Here's an entry from 30 years ago. Saw Hartwell's truck parked by the creek again. He knows. Question is what he plans to do about it." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Hartwell hadn't just been claiming land that didn't belong to him. He'd been actively mining it, extracting valuable resources while paying taxes to maintain the appearance of legitimate ownership. "We need to contact a lawyer," Sarah said quietly. "This isn't just about property boundaries anymore. If Hartwell has been mining your land illegally for decades, you could be entitled to damages on top of recovering the stolen acreage." As they made their way back through the woods, Jake felt the weight of his grandfather's hidden legacy settling on his shoulders. The old man had spent his final years gathering evidence of a betrayal that stretched back generations, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what had been stolen from his family. The silence in the basement felt heavier than the dust motes dancing in the flashlight beam. Marcus stared at the wooden crate, his heart hammering against his ribs as he processed what lay before him. The brass nameplate gleamed despite decades of neglect. Colonel Theodore Blackwood. Personal effects. His grandfather had been a colonel. This single revelation sent Marcus's mind reeling through every conversation they'd shared, every story that had been conspicuously absent from Theodore's tales of his youth. The old man had spoken of farming, of building the property with his own hands, of meeting Marcus's grandmother at a church social. Never once had he mentioned military service. Scout whined softly beside him, pawing at the edge of the crate. The dog's earlier excitement had transformed into something more subdued, as if he too sensed the gravity of their discovery. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for the brass clasps holding the crate shut. They were stiff with age but gave way with surprising ease, as though they'd been opened recently. The hinges groaned in protest as he lifted the heavy lid, revealing contents that made his breath catch in his throat. Medals lay nestled in faded velvet compartments, their ribbons still vibrant despite the years. A purple heart caught the light, its golden profile unmistakable even to Marcus's untrained eye. Beside it, a bronze star gleamed with quiet dignity, but it was the third medal that made Marcus lean closer, squinting in the dim light. The distinctive blue field dotted with white stars was unmistakable, a Medal of Honor. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible in the confined space. His grandfather hadn't just been a soldier, he'd been a decorated war hero. Beneath the medals, Marcus found a leather portfolio tied with a black ribbon. His fingers fumbled with the knot, finally working it loose to reveal a collection of documents that would have been better preserved in a museum than a basement crate. Commendations, battle reports, and photographs spilled across his lap. The photographs transported him to a different world entirely. Young men in crisp uniforms smiled at the camera with the kind of innocence that war would soon steal from them. In the center of one group photo stood a man Marcus almost didn't recognize, his grandfather, decades younger, standing tall and proud in an officer's uniform. But it was the handwritten letter tucked between the photographs that made Marcus's blood run cold. The letterhead bore the seal of the United States Army, and the date showed it had been written just 3 months before his grandfather's death. "Dear Colonel Blackwood," Marcus read aloud, his voice growing stronger as Scout settled beside him. "Following your recent inquiry regarding the Monuments Men recovery operations, we are pleased to inform you that several items matching your descriptions have been located in our secured facilities. As the surviving member of your unit and pursuant to the cultural property repatriation protocols established in 1998, you are hereby authorized to claim custody of these artifacts." Marcus's hands shook as he continued reading. The letter went on to list items that sounded more like a museum inventory than personal effects: Renaissance painting, artist unknown, oil on canvas, approximately 24 by 36 inches. Medieval illuminated manuscript, partial, estimated 14th century. Collection of Roman coins, various denominations and periods. At the bottom of the letter, a handwritten note in his grandfather's familiar scrawl: "Package arrived Tuesday. Items secured in location Alpha-7. God forgive us for what we kept hidden all these years." Marcus set the letter down with trembling hands, his mind racing to piece together the implications. His grandfather had been part of the Monuments Men, the Allied unit tasked with protecting and recovering cultural artifacts during World War II. Somehow, Theodore had ended up in possession of priceless historical artifacts, and according to this letter, they were hidden somewhere on the property. Location Alpha-7. Marcus's military background told him this had to be some kind of coded reference, but to what? He studied the basement around him with new eyes, looking for any clue that might point him toward his grandfather's hidden cache. Scout suddenly lifted his head, ears perked and focused on the far corner of the basement. The dog rose slowly, his tail lowered, and padded toward a section of wall that looked identical to every other section. But as Scout sniffed along the baseboard, Marcus noticed something he'd missed before: a slight discoloration in the concrete, where one section met another. "What is it, boy?" Marcus whispered, following the dog across the basement floor. As he knelt beside Scout, Marcus could see that what he'd initially taken for natural settling cracks were actually carefully concealed seams. Someone had removed a section of the basement wall and replaced it so skillfully that only the most careful inspection would reveal the deception. Marcus pressed his palm against the wall and felt it give slightly under pressure. Behind this false wall lay the answers to questions he'd never thought to ask about his grandfather's past, and possibly the key to saving everything he'd thought was lost. The morning light filtering through the cracked windows of the old farmhouse cast dancing shadows across the walls as Jake carefully examined the contents of the leather portfolio. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded yellowed maps and documents that appeared to date back decades. Rusty lay beside him, occasionally lifting his head to watch the door, as if sensing the gravity of what they'd discovered. The first document was a deed, but not for the farmhouse property. It described a parcel of land 30 miles north near the abandoned mining district that had been closed since the 1970s. Jake's grandfather's signature was unmistakable at the bottom, alongside another name he didn't recognize: Theodore Blackwood. The date showed it was signed just 2 months before his grandfather's death. Jake spread out the geological survey maps, his pulse quickening as he studied the symbols and markings. Red X's marked specific locations, with handwritten notes in his grandfather's careful script: primary vein confirmed, assay results positive, and most intriguingly, TB agrees to 60/40ths split pending full extraction. A noise outside made both Jake and Rusty freeze. Footsteps crunched across the gravel driveway, deliberate and heavy. Jake quickly gathered the documents, stuffing them back into the portfolio as voices approached the front door. "I know he's in there," came a gruff voice Jake didn't recognize. "Saw the truck this morning." "Just remember what we discussed," replied another man, this voice smoother, more refined. "We're simply making an offer, a generous one." The knock on the door was firm and insistent. Rusty growled low in his throat, hackles rising. Jake slipped the portfolio behind a loose board in the wall and made his way to the door, trying to appear casual despite his racing heart. Two men stood on the sagging porch. The first was tall and lean, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the rural setting. His companion was shorter but broader, with the look of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than charm. "Mr. Morrison," the well-dressed man extended a manicured hand. "I'm Richard Sterling, and this is my associate Frank. We represent certain business interests that might be relevant to your current situation." Jake shook the offered hand cautiously. "What kind of business interests?" Sterling smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The kind that could solve your financial difficulties quite permanently. May we come in?" Against his better judgment, Jake stepped aside. The men entered, Sterling's gaze sweeping the interior with obvious distaste, while Frank positioned himself near the door. Rusty maintained his low growl, staying close to Jake's side. "I'll cut straight to the point," Sterling said, pulling out a folded paper from his jacket. "We're prepared to offer you $200,000 for this property. Cash, no questions asked, with a closing date within the week." Jake's mind reeled. 200,000 was more money than he'd ever imagined having, enough to pay off every debt and start fresh somewhere else. But the timing felt too convenient, too connected to what he'd just discovered. "That's very generous," Jake said carefully, "but I'm not looking to sell right now." Frank shifted his weight, and Jake caught a glimpse of something metallic beneath the man's jacket. Sterling's smile became more strained. "Mr. Morrison, I think you misunderstand your position. This property is worthless farmland with a house that's ready to collapse. We're offering you a way out of poverty. Surely you can see the wisdom in accepting such an offer. And surely you can see that rushing into major decisions isn't very wise," Jake countered. "If you're interested in the property, you can contact me next week. I need time to think." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sterling exchanged a meaningful look with Frank before turning back to Jake. "Time isn't something we have in abundance, Mr. Morrison. Market conditions can change rapidly, and opportunities like this have a way of disappearing." The threat was barely veiled, but Jake stood his ground. "I appreciate the offer, but my answer stands. I need time to consider." Sterling's facade finally cracked, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Your grandfather was a stubborn man too. It didn't serve him well in the end." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Jake felt Rusty tense beside him, the dog's instincts clearly screaming danger. "I think you should leave now," Jake said quietly. Sterling nodded slowly, folding the offer and returning it to his pocket. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Morrison, soon." He paused at the door, looking back. "For your own sake, I hope you'll reconsider. This town can be a dangerous place for people who don't know when to accept help." After they left, Jake watched through the window as their black sedan disappeared down the dirt road. His hands were shaking as he retrieved the portfolio from its hiding place. Whatever his grandfather had discovered, others knew about it too, and they were willing to go to considerable lengths to get their hands on it. The game had just become far more dangerous than Jake had imagined. The town meeting erupted in chaos the moment Jake finished speaking. Folding chairs scraped against the wooden floor as dozens of people rose to their feet, voices rising in a cacophony of disbelief, anger, and desperate hope. Mayor Hendricks banged his gavel repeatedly, but the sound was lost in the uproar. "You're telling us my family's been broke for 40 years because of stolen money?" shouted Pete Morrison, his weathered face flushed red. "My daddy lost the farm because he couldn't get a loan," called out Sarah Chen from the back row. "If the bank had that gold." Jake held up his hands, trying to restore order. Beside him, Detective Walsh stood ready to intervene, while Rex pressed closer to Jake's legs, sensing the tension in the room. The manila folder containing photocopies of his grandfather's ledgers felt heavy in Jake's grip. "Please, everyone, let me explain what we found," Jake said, his voice carrying over the din. Gradually, the crowd settled back into their seats, though whispers continued to ripple through the assembly. Martha Hendricks, the mayor's wife and head of the Historical Society, adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses. "Jake, honey, your grandfather was a good man, but these are serious accusations. Are you certain about what you're claiming?" Detective Walsh stepped forward. "Mrs. Hendricks, we've verified the authenticity of the documents. The State Bureau is conducting a full investigation into the bank records from 1982 to 1985. What Mr. Coleman has discovered appears to corroborate several suspicious transactions that were never fully explained." Jake opened the folder and pulled out a photocopy of one of the ledger pages. "My grandfather documented everything, dates, amounts, even the serial numbers on some of the gold coins. He was trying to trace where it all went." His voice caught slightly. I think he knew he was in danger toward the end." The room fell silent except for the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Old Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store, cleared his throat. Samuel always seemed nervous those last few months. Kept looking over his shoulder. We all figured it was his age catching up with him. "He came to see me 3 times that final winter," added Dr. Patricia Wells, the town's longtime physician. "Complained of insomnia, said he couldn't stop thinking about old mistakes. I prescribed sleeping pills, but he never picked them up." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Every new detail painted a picture of his grandfather as a man tormented by secrets, perhaps fearing for his life. "Detective Walsh found something else," he said quietly. "Grandpa had been receiving threatening letters. Someone knew he was investigating." Mayor Hendricks leaned forward in his chair. "Threatening letters? From whom?" "We're still analyzing them," Walsh replied. "But they reference keeping quiet about old business and mention consequences if he continued digging where he shouldn't." Agnes Putterman, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up from her front row seat. "This is all very dramatic, but what does it mean for us now? The bank's been closed for 15 years. Most of the people involved are dead or gone." Jake exchanged a glance with Detective Walsh. They had discussed this question extensively over the past week. "The gold and cash we found has been turned over to the state. There's going to be a legal process to determine how much of it represents stolen funds versus legitimate assets. If portions are proven to be stolen bank assets, there could be reparations." "Reparations?" Pete Morrison's voice cracked with emotion. "You mean we might get back what was taken from us?" "It's complicated," Walsh cautioned. "Insurance companies, federal banking authorities, and a state law all come into play. But yes, there's a possibility that those who suffered financial losses due to the bank's collapse could see some compensation." The room buzzed with renewed energy, but Jake felt a weight settling on his shoulders. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, people who had struggled for decades, lost homes and businesses, watched their children leave town because there were no opportunities left. The burden of potentially changing their lives felt enormous. "There's something else," he said, causing the conversations to die away again. "The investigation isn't over. Whoever was working with the bank officials might still be alive. The threats against my grandfather suggest someone in this community was involved." Uncomfortable silence stretched across the room. People began glancing at each other sideways, decades of trust suddenly feeling fragile. Jake realized he might have just planted seeds of suspicion that would grow into something poisonous. Rex whined softly and nudged Jake's hand with his nose, as if sensing his master's distress. Jake scratched behind the dog's ears, drawing comfort from the simple, honest affection. Whatever complications arose from this discovery, at least he knew Rex's loyalty was unconditional. "What happens next?" asked Martha Hendricks. Detective Walsh closed his notebook. "We continue investigating, and we wait for the state's determination about the assets. In the meantime, I'd advise everyone to think carefully about anything unusual you might remember from that time period. Any detail could be important." As people began filing out of the community center, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they had opened a door that could never be closed again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the property as Tom knelt beside the exposed cavity beneath the floorboards, his hands trembling as he lifted another bundle of documents from the hidden compartment. Rex sat alert beside him, tail wagging occasionally as if sensing the magnitude of their discovery. The papers were wrapped in oiled leather, preserved despite decades of concealment. Tom's grandfather had been meticulous, protecting each document with the care of someone who understood their true value. As Tom unfolded the first deed, his breath caught in his throat. The property boundaries outlined in faded ink extended far beyond what he'd inherited, encompassing nearly half the town's commercial district. "This can't be right," he whispered, but the official seals and signatures were unmistakable. His grandfather hadn't just owned the crumbling farmhouse, he'd owned the land beneath Miller's Hardware, the new shopping center, and the planned development site that had the whole town buzzing. Rex whined softly, nudging Tom's elbow with his wet nose. The dog had been restless since yesterday's discovery, as if he sensed the danger lurking beneath their newfound fortune. Tom scratched behind Rex's ears absently, his mind racing through the implications. A sharp knock at the front door shattered the morning quiet. Tom quickly gathered the documents, shoving them back into their hiding place and replacing the loose floorboard. Rex's hackles rose, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Tom Henley, open up. We need to talk." Tom recognized Mayor Davidson's voice, but it carried an edge he'd never heard before. Through the grimy window, he spotted 3 black sedans parked along the dirt road. His stomach lurched as he counted at least 6 men in expensive suits flanking the mayor. "Just a minute," Tom called out, his voice cracking. He pressed his hand against the concealed compartment one final time, ensuring the floorboard sat flush. Rex remained tense beside him, ears pricked forward in alert attention. Tom opened the door to find Mayor Davidson's usual politician's smile replaced by a stern expression. The men behind him weren't locals. Their clean-shaven faces and identical dark suits screamed corporate enforcement. "Tom, I think there's been a misunderstanding about your inheritance," the mayor began, stepping forward uninvited. "We've discovered some discrepancies in the property records, legal complications that need immediate resolution." "What kind of complications?" Tom asked, blocking the doorway. Rex positioned himself between Tom and the visitors, a protective barrier of fur and muscle. One of the suited men stepped forward, pulling out an official-looking folder. "Mr. Henley, I'm representing Davidson Development Corporation. We've uncovered evidence that your grandfather's property claims were invalid. Fraudulent documentation, falsified deeds, the kind of thing that could land someone in serious legal trouble." Tom's mind raced. These men had appeared too quickly, too organized. Someone had been watching, waiting for him to discover what lay hidden beneath the floorboards. But how could they know? "I'd like to see my lawyer before discussing anything," Tom said carefully. The mayor laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "Tom, let's be reasonable. You're a simple farmer who inherited a worthless piece of land. Why complicate things with lawyers and courts? We're prepared to make you a generous offer, enough to start fresh somewhere else, far from all this mess." "How generous?" Tom asked, buying time while his thoughts churned. $50,000 cash today. Clean break, no questions asked. The figure was laughable compared to what Tom now knew the property was worth, but it confirmed his suspicions. These men weren't here to help him. They were here to steal his inheritance. The same inheritance his grandfather had died protecting. Rex suddenly barked sharply, his attention fixed on something beyond the group of men. Tom followed the dog's gaze and spotted a figure crouched near the back of the house, someone trying to access the rear entrance while everyone was distracted at the front door. "I think I need more time to consider your offer," Tom said loudly, hoping to alert the intruder that he'd been spotted. The mayor's expression hardened. "Time is a luxury you don't have, Tom. These legal issues won't disappear, and my associates aren't known for their patience." The threat was barely veiled, but Tom had expected this moment since Rex's initial discovery. His grandfather's careful concealment of the documents hadn't been paranoia. It had been protection against exactly this kind of pressure. "Then I guess we have a problem," Tom said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Because I'm not selling." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Rex's growl deepened, and Tom could see the calculation in the mayor's eyes. Whatever game was being played, Tom had just forced the next move. One of the suited men whispered something in the mayor's ear, and Davidson nodded grimly. "Very well, Tom, but don't say we didn't try to handle this the easy way." The sheriff's cruiser disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Jake standing in his grandfather's kitchen with Detective Morrison and Agent Chen. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the gentle whimpering of Rusty, who had positioned himself protectively at Jake's feet. "We need to talk about what happens next," Detective Morrison said, settling into one of the rickety wooden chairs. The detective's weathered face showed the strain of the past few days, deep lines etched around his eyes that hadn't been there when this all started. Agent Chen remained standing, his federal bearing making the humble kitchen seem even smaller. "The FBI has protocols for cases involving stolen artifacts of this magnitude. Your grandfather's collection represents one of the largest recoveries of World War II plunder in recent history." Jake felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. Millions of dollars in art, jewelry, and precious metals had been hidden beneath his feet for decades while he'd struggled to keep food on the table. The irony wasn't lost on him, but neither was the growing realization that his problems were far from over. "What about the Rothschild painting?" Jake asked, remembering the haunting portrait that had started this avalanche of revelations. "And the other pieces with clear provenance?" "Those will be returned to their rightful owners or their heirs," Chen replied. "It's going to be a complex process. Some families have been searching for these items for 70 years. Detective Morrison leaned forward, his voice gentle but serious. "Jake, you need to understand something. Even though you had no knowledge of these items, their discovery on your property makes you a person of interest in multiple international investigations. We believe you're innocent, but there are others who might not be so convinced." The implication hung heavy in the air. Jake thought about the mysterious phone calls, the feeling of being watched, the break-in at his trailer. Whoever had been after the treasure hadn't given up just because the authorities were now involved. How many people knew about this? The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmhouse porch as Marcus sat hunched over his grandfather's journal, the leather binding cracked and weathered in his hands. Rusty lay beside him, ears perked at every sound from the road. Word had spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire, and Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before unwanted visitors arrived. The journal's pages revealed more than he'd initially understood. His grandfather hadn't just been hiding gold, he'd been protecting it. Entry after entry detailed Joseph's careful research into the provenance of each piece, tracking down rightful heirs of families who'd lost everything during the war. The old man had spent decades trying to return what wasn't his, but many of the families had simply vanished without a trace. "He wasn't a thief," Marcus whispered to Rusty, who thumped his tail in response. "He was trying to make things right." A cloud of dust on the horizon caught his attention. 3 black SUVs were approaching, moving with the kind of purposeful speed that made his stomach clench. Marcus closed the journal and tucked it inside his jacket. Whatever was coming, he had a feeling his grandfather's careful documentation was about to become very important. The vehicles pulled into his driveway with military precision, disgorging a collection of serious-faced men and women in dark suits. At their head walked a tall woman with silver hair and cold blue eyes that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of winter mornings. "Mr. Holloway," she called out, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. We need to discuss your recent discovery." Marcus remained seated, one hand resting on Rusty's head. "News travels fast around here, faster than you might think. May we come up?" He gestured to the porch steps, watching as Agent Chen climbed alone while her team maintained their positions around the vehicles. She moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. "I suppose someone reported the gold," Marcus said. "Several someones, actually. Small towns aren't known for their discretion." Chen settled into the old wooden chair across from him, her posture relaxed but alert. "What's more interesting is what our initial investigation has revealed about the items you found." Marcus felt his heart rate quicken. Such as the fact that roughly 60% of those pieces match descriptions from our database of stolen Nazi gold. Items that disappeared from a train shipment in 1944, somewhere in the European theatre. Her eyes never left his face. Items that several international agencies have been tracking for decades. The weight of the journal against his ribs suddenly felt enormous. "My grandfather never mentioned—" "Your grandfather was Staff Sergeant Joseph Holloway, 2nd Armored Division. He was part of the unit that liberated the train carrying those artifacts." Chen leaned forward slightly. What he did with them afterward has been something of a mystery. Until now. Marcus's mind raced. The journal entries suddenly made more sense. His grandfather's obsession with finding the families, his careful notes about origins and ownership. He was trying to return them. That's one theory. Chen's tone remained neutral. Another is that he simply got away with one of the largest thefts in wartime history. No, the word came out harder than Marcus intended. "You don't understand. He kept records. He tried to find the rightful owners." Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. "Records?" Before Marcus could respond, Rusty's low growl drew his attention to the road. Another vehicle was approaching, this one a battered pickup truck, moving at dangerous speed. It skidded to a stop behind the FBI vehicles, and Billy Cartwright jumped out, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like desperation. "Marcus!" Billy called out, ignoring the federal agents who immediately moved to intercept him. "We need to talk, right now." Agent Chen stood smoothly, her hand moving instinctively toward her jacket. "Sir, this is a federal investigation. You need to—" "I know where the rest of it is," Billy interrupted, his words cutting through the morning air like a blade. He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes wild. "My grandfather left me something too. Something he said I should only use if the Holloway treasure ever came to light." "Mr. Cartwright," Agent Chen said carefully, "I think you'd better join us on the porch." As Billy climbed the steps, Marcus caught sight of something in his neighbor's eyes he'd never seen before. Fear mixed with relief, as if a burden carried for too long was finally being set down. Whatever Billy's grandfather had left him, it was connected to the gold beneath Marcus's floorboards. The family secret was apparently bigger than any of them had imagined. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Marcus like a physical force as he sat in the dim glow of his grandfather's old desk lamp, surrounded by ledgers, photographs, and documents that painted a picture of a life he'd never known existed. Buster lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to study his master's face with those knowing brown eyes that had started this incredible journey. The knock at the door came just after midnight, sharp and insistent. Marcus's blood ran cold. Through the curtains he could see the shadows of multiple figures on his porch. He quickly gathered the most important documents, stuffing them into the old leather satchel his grandfather had used for trips to town. "Marcus Webb, we know you're in there." The voice was unfamiliar, authoritative. "We just want to talk." Buster's hackles rose, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The dog's instincts had never failed them before. Marcus extinguished the lamp and moved silently toward the back of the house, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the kitchen window, he spotted more figures positioned around the property's perimeter. These weren't locals from town. These were professionals. He slipped out through the cellar entrance, the same route Buster had taken that first day when curiosity had led to the loose floorboard that changed everything. The night air was crisp, filled with the scent of approaching autumn. Moving low through the overgrown garden, Marcus made his way toward the old barn where his grandfather's ancient Ford pickup sat under a tarp. The engine turned over on the third try, coughing to life like a awakening giant. As headlights flooded the barnyard, Marcus gunned the accelerator, bursting through the partially open doors. Buster leaped into the passenger seat as shouts erupted behind them. Through the rearview mirror, Marcus watched his grandfather's house shrink into the darkness, wondering if he'd ever see it again. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 months ago, he'd have gladly walked away from that crumbling property. Now it felt like leaving behind a piece of his soul. The truck's headlights carved a path through the winding country roads as Marcus drove toward the only person he trusted completely. Sarah had been skeptical when he'd first shared fragments of his discovery, but her historian's instincts had kicked in when she'd seen the authenticated documents. More importantly, she'd believed in him when the rest of the town still saw him as the same failed farmer who'd inherited a worthless pile of timber and regret. A cottage sat at the edge of Millbrook's historic district, a small beacon of warmth in the pre-dawn darkness. Marcus killed the engine 2 blocks away and approached on foot, Buster trotting silently beside him. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat, every sound amplified in the stillness. Sarah answered his gentle tap immediately, as if she'd been waiting. Her hair was tousled from sleep, but her eyes were alert and concerned. "Marcus, what's happened?" "They came for me," he whispered, stepping inside as she quickly closed the door behind them. "Professional types." They knew about the documents. Her face paled as the implications sank in. "The consortium?" Marcus nodded grimly. For weeks, they'd been piecing together the puzzle his grandfather had left behind. The mining rights weren't just valuable. They were the key to a lithium deposit that could power the clean energy revolution. His grandfather hadn't been a simple farmer at all, but a careful guardian of resources that could reshape the entire region's economy. "We need to get these to your contact at the university," Marcus said, patting the satchel. "Tonight." Sarah was already reaching for her coat. "Professor Chen is expecting my call. He's been researching the geological surveys you found." "Marcus, if he's right about the deposit's size," she paused, studying his face in the dim light. "This could be worth hundreds of millions." Buster whined softly from his position by the window, ears perked toward some distant sound. Marcus felt the familiar chill of recognition. His dog's warnings had become their early detection system. "Car engines," Sarah whispered, confirming his fears. "Multiple vehicles." They moved quickly through her kitchen to the back door. Sarah's Honda sat in the narrow alley behind her cottage, partially hidden by overhanging branches. As they climbed inside, Marcus caught sight of dark SUVs turning onto Sarah's street, their headlights methodically sweeping each house. "How did they track us so quickly?" Sarah asked as she started the engine. Marcus's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. "Someone in town is feeding them information. Someone who knew I'd come to you." The realization stung worse than the physical danger. Millbrook had been his home his entire life, its people his neighbors and supposed friends, but greed had a way of reshaping loyalties, and news of his discovery had clearly spread further than he'd imagined. As they drove through the empty streets toward the highway, Marcus made a silent promise to his grandfather's memory. Whatever it took, he would protect the legacy that had been entrusted to him. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Jake's worn boots as he clutched the metal box against his chest. Sheriff Martinez walked beside him, her hand resting protectively on her service weapon, while Deputy Chen brought up the rear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the square, and Jake could see curious faces peering from shop windows as word of their discovery spread through town like wildfire. "We need to get this to the bank vault immediately," Martinez said, her voice low but urgent. "Too many people already know about this, and I don't like the attention we're drawing." Jake nodded, though his mind was still reeling from what they'd found in his grandfather's hidden chamber. The deed to the Whitmore Mining Company, stock certificates worth millions, and most shocking of all, a detailed confession from his grandfather about how he'd discovered corruption in the company's books decades ago. The evidence had been sitting beneath those rotting floorboards all these years, waiting. As they approached First National Bank, Jake spotted a familiar figure leaning against a black sedan parked across the street. Victoria Blackwood straightened when she saw them, her perfectly styled hair catching the sunlight, her expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses. "Sheriff," she called out, crossing the street with confident strides. "I hear there's been quite a discovery at the old Hendricks place." Martinez stepped slightly in front of Jake. "Ms. Blackwood, interesting how quickly news travels in this town." Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "Small towns have their charms. I don't suppose you'd be willing to share what you've found. My family has had interests in that property for quite some time." "I bet they have," Jake muttered, remembering his grandfather's journal entries about the Blackwood family's persistent attempts to buy his land over the years. Victoria's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment her composed mask slipped. "Mr. Hendricks, I think you'll find that any claims you believe you might have could be complicated. Legal ownership isn't always as straightforward as one might hope." Before Jake could respond, Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is an ongoing investigation." Victoria's laugh was cold. "Investigation? Into what exactly? Finding old papers in a decrepit house hardly constitutes a crime." She paused, adjusting her sunglasses. "Though I suppose it depends on what those papers contain." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The way she spoke suggested she knew more about his grandfather's secrets than she was letting on. He thought about the confession letter, how it detailed not just the mining company corruption, but also mentioned threats his grandfather had received when he'd tried to expose the truth. "We need to move," Martinez said quietly, guiding Jake toward the bank entrance. As they walked away, Victoria called after them. "Mr. Hendricks, my offer to purchase your property still stands. In fact, given recent developments, I might be willing to increase it substantially. It would save everyone a great deal of trouble." Jake stopped and turned back. "What kind of trouble?" Victoria's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The kind that comes with digging up the past. Some secrets are buried for good reason." Inside the bank, Jake watched as the manager, Mr. Peterson, carefully examined the contents of the metal box. The elderly man's hands trembled slightly as he handled the stock certificates, his face growing pale as he read the dates and signatures. "These appear to be authentic," Peterson said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they are, Mr. Hendricks, you're looking at controlling interest in one of the largest mining operations in the state." He looked up, his eyes wide behind thick glasses. "The current value would be substantial." Sheriff Martinez leaned forward. "How substantial?" Peterson consulted his computer, typing rapidly. "Conservative estimate, $47 million. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. Jake felt his knees weaken, and he gripped the edge of Peterson's desk for support. $47 million. It was more money than he'd ever dreamed of, enough to save his farm, pay off his debts, and secure his future for generations. But as he stared at the documents spread across Peterson's desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria Blackwood's warning carried real weight. His grandfather had hidden these papers for a reason, had kept this secret for over 30 years until his death. The confession letter made it clear that he'd been afraid, that powerful people had wanted him silenced. Through the bank's front window, Jake could see Victoria still standing beside her sedan, talking animatedly on her phone. Even from this distance, her body language conveyed urgency, perhaps even desperation. "Sheriff," Jake said slowly, "I think we're going to need protection." Martinez followed his gaze to the window. "Already ahead of you, I've called in favors with the state police. But Jake, you need to understand something. Money this significant doesn't just change your life, it changes you into a target." The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmhouse porch as Jake stood facing the assembled crowd that had gathered in his front yard. Word had spread through town faster than wildfire about the discovery beneath his grandfather's floorboards, and now it seemed like half the county had shown up to gawk at the man they'd been laughing at just days before. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face serious, as he addressed the murmuring crowd. "Folks, I need everyone to step back and give us some room to work. This is now an active investigation, and we can't have people trampling all over potential evidence." Jake watched as the same neighbors who had snickered behind his back just last week now stared at him with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked suspiciously like envy. Martha Henderson from the diner elbowed her way closer, her eyes bright with gossip-hungry anticipation. "Is it true what they're saying, Jake?" she called out. "Did you really find old Confederate gold under there?" Before Jake could answer, a black sedan pulled up the gravel drive, and two men in expensive suits climbed out. The taller one, carrying a leather briefcase, approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm David Blackstone from Blackstone and Associates. We represent certain historical preservation interests, and we'd like to discuss your recent discovery." Sheriff Morrison immediately positioned himself between Jake and the newcomers. "And just what kind of interests would those be, gentlemen? Because right now, this property is part of an ongoing investigation." The second man, younger but equally polished, pulled out a thick manila envelope. "We have documentation suggesting that any Civil War-era artifacts found on this property may actually belong to the State Historical Society. There are laws governing such discoveries." Jake felt his stomach drop. After everything he'd been through, after finally having hope that he could save the farm and build a future, were these lawyers going to take it all away? Rusty, who had been lying quietly at Jake's feet, suddenly stood and began growling low in his throat. The dog's hackles rose as he stared at the two men, his instincts clearly telling him something was wrong. "That's interesting," Sheriff Morrison said slowly, "because I just got off the phone with the State Historical Society not an hour ago, and they assured me they hadn't sent any representatives out here." The color drained from Blackstone's face, but he quickly recovered his composure. "There must be some miscommunication. We're working with a federal division that—" "Sheriff!" Deputy Collins came jogging around the side of the house, holding something in his gloved hands. "You need to see this. We found it wedged behind one of the support beams." Jake craned his neck to see what the deputy was holding. It appeared to be an old leather journal, its pages yellowed with age, but still intact, thanks to being wrapped in oiled cloth. Morrison took the journal carefully and opened it to the first page. His eyes widened as he read. "Well, I'll be damned. This is dated 1863, and it's signed by your great-great-grandfather, Thomas Hartwell." The crowd pressed closer, but Morrison held up a warning hand. "It says here that Thomas was working as a courier for the Union Army, not the Confederacy. Apparently, he was tasked with intercepting Confederate gold shipments and routing them to Union forces." Blackstone stepped forward aggressively. "Regardless of the historical details, federal law is clear about such discoveries. We have the authority to—" "Actually, you don't." Everyone turned to see an elderly woman making her way through the crowd, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. Jake recognized her as Eleanor Whitmore, the town's retired librarian and unofficial historian. "I've been researching the Hartwell family for years," Eleanor continued, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Thomas Hartwell was indeed a Union courier, and according to military records I've found, any gold he recovered was considered his payment for services rendered. It was never technically government property." The fake lawyers exchanged nervous glances. Blackstone made one last attempt. "We'll need to verify that information through proper channels." "You'll need to do that from somewhere else," Sheriff Morrison interrupted firmly. "Gentlemen, unless you can provide legitimate credentials and proper documentation, I'm going to have to ask you to leave this property immediately." As the two men reluctantly retreated to their sedan, Jake felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see his neighbor, old Pete Garrison, the same man who had made jokes about Jake's inheritance just days earlier. "Jake," Pete said quietly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. Your family's got more honor than any of us gave them credit for." Around the yard, Jake saw nods of agreement and sheepish expressions on faces that had shown him nothing but pity and amusement before. The discovery had changed more than just his financial prospects. It had restored his family's reputation and his own standing in the community. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Jake stood on the wraparound porch of his grandfather's house, now fully restored to its former glory. The rotting boards had been replaced with gleaming hardwood, the sagging roof rebuilt, and fresh white paint made the Victorian mansion shine like a beacon against the rolling hills. 6 months had passed since Rusty's discovery beneath those crumbling floorboards, and Jake's world had transformed beyond recognition. The collection of Civil War artifacts and gold coins hidden in his grandfather's secret chamber had indeed been worth millions, just as the appraiser had estimated. But more valuable than the money was what Jake had learned about his family's history. His great-great-grandfather had been a Union spy who had helped smuggle escaped slaves to freedom through the Underground Railroad. The house itself had been a station, with hidden passages and secret rooms that Jake was still discovering. Rusty bounded up the porch steps, his tail wagging furiously as he dropped a tennis ball at Jake's feet. The golden retriever looked healthier than ever, his coat glossy and his eyes bright with contentment. Jake scratched behind his ears, remembering that desperate night when his faithful companion had led him to their fortune. "Jake Miller, you old dog!" the familiar voice of Tom Patterson called out from the gravel driveway. Jake's former neighbor climbed out of his pickup truck, grinning widely. The same people who had laughed at Jake's inheritance now treated him like a local celebrity, though Jake had been careful to remain the same humble man he'd always been. "Morning, Tom. What brings you by?" "Wanted to see how the museum preparations are coming along." Tom gestured toward the house with obvious admiration. "Still can't believe you're turning this into a historical site instead of just keeping all that money for yourself." Jake smiled, running his hand along the freshly painted porch railing. It had been an easy decision, really. After learning about his ancestors' role in the Underground Railroad, he knew the house needed to be preserved and shared with the world. He'd kept enough of the treasure to pay off his debts, fix up his own farm, and live comfortably, but the rest would fund the museum and provide educational programs for local schools. "My grandfather would have wanted it this way," Jake said. "Besides, some things are more important than money." Sheriff Davies's patrol car pulled up behind Tom's truck, and the lawman stepped out with a broad smile. Over the past months, he'd become one of Jake's closest friends, helping to navigate the legal complexities of the treasure discovery and the house's historical designation. "The state inspector just called," Davies announced, climbing the porch steps. "You passed all the final requirements. The Miller House Underground Railroad Museum will officially open next month." Jake felt a surge of pride and satisfaction. The name had been another easy choice, honoring both his family and the brave souls who had risked everything for freedom. The secret passages had been carefully preserved and would allow visitors to experience a small part of what those desperate journeys must have felt like. "That's wonderful news," Jake said. "Sarah will be thrilled." Dr. Sarah Chen, the historian who had helped authenticate the artifacts, had become much more than a professional colleague. Their shared passion for preserving history had blossomed into something deeper, and Jake found himself happier than he'd been in years. As if summoned by his thoughts, Sarah's car turned into the driveway. She stepped out carrying a folder of documents, her face glowing with excitement. The Smithsonian confirmed it, she called out before she even reached the porch. "They want to feature 3 of your artifacts in their new Civil War exhibition. This will put your museum on the national map." Jake shook his head in amazement. 6 months ago, he'd been a failing farmer facing bankruptcy, mocked by his neighbors and ready to give up on his dreams. Now he was about to open a nationally recognized museum, had found love, and discovered a family legacy that filled him with pride. Tom clapped Jake on the shoulder. "You know, I owe you an apology. We all do. The way the town treated you when you first inherited this place. We were wrong." "Water under the bridge," Jake replied, meaning it. The hardships had made the victory sweeter, and he bore no grudges against people who had simply been looking out for their own interests. As the afternoon wore on and his visitors departed, Jake found himself alone on the porch with Rusty as the sun began to set. The dog rested his head on Jake's lap, and together they watched the golden light paint the valley in warm hues. "We did it, boy," Jake whispered, stroking Rusty's fur. "We really did it." In the distance, he could see his own farm, now thriving with new equipment and restored fields. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he prepared for the museum's opening, but tonight Jake Miller was exactly where he belonged, home at last, with his faithful companion by his side and a future bright with possibility stretching out before them.